Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to talk about all the books that I read in June, and there's some really fun ones in here. So I'm excited to share what I was able to read because there are 22 books. I'm going to run through them relatively quickly just to keep the video of manageable length, and also take a look at my July TBR video, which I'm posting soon, to see all the books I'm hoping to read in the month of July. So to dive in, the first book that I picked up was the 22nd book in the Joe Pickett series called Shadows Reel. And this is a book about a law enforcement officer who works in the woods, basically. And so all of the different crimes throughout the series are things that take place related to like animal poaching. There's obviously murders and other things that happen in this series, but this is a very long-running series about Joe Pickett, his daughters, and his wife, who happens to be a small-town librarian. And they also have a close friend who is someone who works with like predator birds, like hawks and falcons. It may not sound super interesting as I'm describing it, but I've loved this series. Obviously, I've read up to book 22. So this is a book that I found also really interesting. It involves some kind of memorabilia from World War II involving Nazis, and the crimes kind of revolve around that particular plotline. After that, I read The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hong, and I've never read this author before. This is a romance novel that centers around a woman who is an econometrician, is probably how he's probably pronounced. She works for a company and does work with economics, and she identifies as autistic and has had a hard time with relationships and ends up hiring a male escort to help her figure out how to be a good girlfriend or in a relationship. I really liked how this book played out in terms of the storyline. This is a lot about consent and safety within a relationship and helping her to feel kind of in control as things are moving forward. She ends up in a relationship with this male escort who has a background with him being in a Korean family, and so you get some of those elements of that culture as well, and would highly recommend. I thought it was great. Next up, I read a book called Always in December by Emily Stone. This is a book about a woman who meets a man through a bicycle crash, and she is delivering a letter to her parents who died several years before when she was younger. And Christmas is always kind of a tough time for her, and she ends up meeting this man, and they spend several days together around the holidays, and then end up having kind of an on-again, off-again relationship. This is a book that I enjoyed. I would say that it's definitely not a book that kind of wraps everything up in a bow at the end in a way that is, if you're looking for something that's gonna leave you kind of with, I don't want to give anything away, but I would just say like the ending is not entirely happy. So I would just put that out there. If that's something that you look for in books that are a little bit more of a romance novel, you might want to consider that before you pick this one up. I next read Underground Airlines by Ben H. Winters, and this is a book that is basically talking about a futuristic element of the United States where there is still slavery, and but it kind of plays on this idea of the Underground Railroad with underground airlines instead. Now, this book is similar in some ways to Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, so I'm going to talk about them together. I would say if I was going to recommend one of these two, I would recommend Colson Whitehead's, because it is definitely more of like a literary fiction. He does a little bit with like almost magical realism in terms of jumping time in different parts of the story. I think that both of them are good, but if I had to recommend one, I might consider the Colson Whitehead, just because of the content of what is included in both of these books. I ended up reading both of these this month because they both start with the letter U, so they were part of my alphabet challenge. I've been wanting to read them both for a while, and while I enjoyed them both, I think the Colson Whitehead is a little bit ahead in my mind in terms of just the quality of the writing and what he is doing kind of with the narrative overall. I also read the first book in the Uglies series by Scott Westerfield. This is a young adult novel and I think it's a quartet of 4 books talking about a society in which at the age of 16, you're turned from being quote unquote ugly to being pretty. But what happens when you are turned into someone who is pretty, like it affects your brain as well as your body and your characteristics, your physical characteristics. And so in this particular book, there's a girl who kind of runs away before this happens to her. She learns a little bit about what's actually happening in the medical changes in the people who are becoming pretty. And I thought it was a great opening to this series. I definitely would consider picking up another book in this series. It was something that it was on my radar a long time ago and I just never got around to it. Also part of my alphabet challenge for the month. Next, I picked up The Night Swim by Megan Golden, and this is a book that I thought was super fun. It has a subplot about podcasting, which as a podcaster, I always enjoy. So the basic premise of this book is you have the podcaster who's a true crime podcaster, and she is attending a local trial and kind of podcasting about a trial that is about a rape of a girl who's the granddaughter of the local sheriff. And the person who is being put on trial for this is like a local kind of celebrity athlete. And at the same time, she's been approached by someone because of her podcast on true crime that thinks that their sister was murdered, but at the time it was not classified as murder. So there's kind of two storylines going on in this book, one about the rape trial, and then one about the situation with the person who's contacted the podcaster about their sister. I really enjoyed this. I listened to it on audio, and they did kind of a special like musical element when it was the podcast being included in the narrative versus like the actual storyline, which I thought was really great. I think I listened to this in a couple of sittings. I really enjoyed it and found it really interesting. Next, I listened to Jar of Hearts by Jennifer Hillier. So I also had this one on audio. This is a book that I have heard about this author quite a bit. I don't know that I've read anything by her in the past. I've certainly like come across several of her books, but Jar of Hearts is the story of a woman who as an adult is arrested because of the role that she played in the murder of her best friend when she was a teenager. And at the time, her boyfriend was the person who murdered the best friend, but she was like involved in the crime. And so she's put in prison. And then when she gets out, there's a series of events that happen that make it seem like this murderer is back and is committing crimes again. But the boyfriend is still in prison, but he gets let out. I mean, there's all these kind of interesting things about timing. I also really enjoyed this book. I think that it was really well done in terms of pacing and plot and kind of the unveiling of things going back in time of what really happened, you know, when they were in high school together and this other crime was committed. So highly recommend that. Looking forward to picking up more books by this author too. I also picked up several books, 3 more books. I'm looking at my list in the Louise Penny Armand Gamache series. So I started with The Beautiful Mystery, and then I also picked up How the Light Gets In and The Long Way Home. So this was books 8, 9, and 10 in that series. I got on a bit of a tear just because I was so interested in what was happening in these books, and so I just kept reading. I will say I like where the series is going. There's a couple major things that happen in these 3 books. I don't want to give anything away, but I will say that Louise Penny is not afraid to kind of mess with her main characters, whether that means killing off one of the main characters, imprisoning one of the main characters. Like several things happen with these main characters and you don't always see it coming. I do feel like the series in these 3 books takes a bit of a turn because of the role that Armand Gamache, who's the main detective, he kind of shifts his role in the series. And again, I don't want to give anything away because I feel like it's a pretty major plot point. And so it's really shifted the tone of what's happening in this series, which I find kind of interesting. And I have the next book on my list for the upcoming month, so I'm excited to keep going there. I also decided to dive in to an old childhood favorite because I have the whole series on audio, and I listened to the first couple books in the Chronicles of Narnia series. So the first one is called The Magician's Nephew, and if you're not familiar with this series, Narnia is basically like a magical world that these children in the series get access to. And in the first book, The Magician's Nephew, we come to understand kind of the origins of that world. And then in the second book, which is called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's when the children who end up becoming kind of royalty, I don't think that's giving anything away, they become royalty in this magical world. You start to understand how they came into the world in the first place. Very nostalgic for me. I love C.S. Lewis. I took a course on him when I was an undergrad English major, and read these books multiple times when I was a kid, and so it was really fun to revisit them on audio. I also picked up Janice Hallett's The Appeal, and this book was a mixed bag for me. First of all, very difficult to listen to on audio because it's basically a combination of a bunch of emails and letters, and like every email starts out with who it's to, who it's from, the date it was sent, and the subject line. So I do not recommend reading this book on audio. I tried it and it was just really challenging. I ended up having the hard copy, and so I was reading it that way. The premise of this book is also a little bit kind of unclear. There's a theater troupe, and there are family members in this theater troupe who are trying to raise money because there's a child in their family who has cancer, and they're trying to do like a fundraiser for this child and her treatment. Then eventually throughout the book, and this is not a spoiler, it's just part of the plot, somebody dies, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. And basically, like the way that the book is structured is that there's, I think, a lawyer who's given all of these documents to a couple people in the firm who are like interns or something along those lines, and they're trying to go through the documents and understand what happened before this goes to trial. Or there's an appeal, and they're trying to change what happened in a trial that already happened. Now, the appeal, I think, works in two ways. One is appealing a verdict that has already happened. Two is the appeal that they are making to people to raise money for this child's treatment. I found myself skimming some of this book, I'm just going to be honest, because I was like, I'm interested enough to kind of know what happens, but like the way that it was structured in terms of like giving all these documents to these people who are trying to figure it out, and then in the end, it's kind of like the guy who gave them the documents already knew what happened. And so I was like, well, what was the point? If you already kind of knew what all this was, why are they going through all these documents? So I feel like the wrapper around what was going on in the plot could have been improved. The general understanding of kind of what happens, I mean, you don't necessarily see it coming. I did find certain elements of it interesting. It's kind of like a puzzle that you're trying to figure out as you're going through it. And I guess I would pick up something by this author again, but there were elements of this that were just not quite a fit for what I would typically enjoy. Okay, next up I picked up Kirsten Miller's The Change. This is a book that I've heard several people talk about, and it is super fun. I would definitely recommend reading this around the fall time because it's kind of a witchy book about women who, when they go through menopause, develop kind of witch-like characteristics. And so this is, I would say, a revenge type book where women are kind of enacting revenge on different, typically male characters. But it has a great ambiance. It has a definite kind of storyline of like women helping other women. I listened to this on audio also in a couple of sittings, really, really enjoyed it. I think this is a book that a lot of people are going to be talking about in the coming months, and would definitely recommend picking it up. And again, because of its kind of witchy ambiance, might be fun to read in the fall. Next, I picked up a book called Fallen Creed. This is the 7th book in the Writer Creed series, which is a book about a main character who runs a dog training company, and the dogs are trained to find various things. It could be people who are alive, it could be people who are dead. They're trained to find drugs. They're trained, in this case of this book, to find electronics. And this is a book that focuses on a storyline tied in with human trafficking. There is a female character in this book who was a victim of human trafficking, and so that comes up in this plot line, so kind of a trigger warning for that. And this is a book and a series that I've really enjoyed. There's a female character in this series who's an FBI agent who often partners with the dog handler, and she had her own series before it kind of merged with his storyline, and I've read many books by this author. This is a book by Alex Cava, and she has several different series that she's kind of merged together, and I really enjoy them. Next, I picked up a book called 5 Strangers by Evie Adamson, and I want to give a high-level plot summary of this, but basically just say, if you like a book with unreliable narrators, you would like this book, because it's very clear from the very beginning of this book that you have unreliable narrators. The high-level plot is that you've got a couple women who are in a park on a holiday, I think, and they see a violent incident happen. And one of those women is a kind of disgraced journalist, and she's trying to figure out what's going on. And then she has a best friend who is coming to meet her, and the story kind of alternates between their two perspectives. And so you get to see the different perspectives of these two women, both of whom I would classify as unreliable narrators. And so you're kind of trying to piece together what's going on. Now, I will say I had a hypothesis of what was going on pretty early in the book that was incorrect. So it was kind of fun to see what it ended up being, because I wasn't correct about what I thought was going on. So it was interesting, and would definitely recommend it if you're liking books along those lines. Next, I read a book by an author named Sequoia Nagamatsu called How High We Go in the Dark. And this is almost like a collection of interconnected short stories. So it reads like a novel, but it also reads like a collection of short stories that are kind of intertangled with each other. The general idea of this is it is after a kind of plague happened. So it's a post-plague narrative. And some of the stories take place as the plague is getting started, so we kind of understand the origin of it. And some of them are happening after the fact of the plague. In the beginning, this is a plague that only affects children. And so you start to see how the society is kind of dealing with that. And then eventually it kind of morphs into something else. This is, I guess I would call this science fiction to some degree. There's stuff that happens at the end of the book, which I definitely don't want to give away, that for me puts this squarely in a science fiction category. I really enjoyed this. I listened to it on audio. It had a bunch of different narrators. Every kind of chapter is from the perspective of a different person who's being impacted by this. I will say there are elements of this book that get pretty dark. So if you are someone who's a little bit challenged by like child in peril stories, I mean, there's definitely child death in this book because of who's affected by this illness. And there's a couple chapters in particular that go pretty deep into that. But I would definitely recommend this. I found it really interesting. It is definitely different than kind of the pandemic that we've been experiencing with COVID, but it's got some elements that are close to it that, if, again, kind of trigger warning for pandemic narratives, if that's not something you're interested in. This was also a relatively short book that I think you could kind of dip in and out of. Would definitely put it in the genre of literary fiction. Okay. Next, I read Kelly McGonigal's The Upside of Stress, and this was a book that I had assigned myself because of the alphabet challenge of the U letter for the month of June. I'm going to be honest, I like Kelly McGonigal's work a lot, which is why I was excited to pick this up. I think she does really interesting work. She's definitely a crossover academic who writes a lot for more secular audiences. My challenge with this book was, honestly, I found it a little bit boring. I don't know exactly why, because I find the information interesting in general, this idea that stress can be good for us, that we can learn how to deal with stress in a way that is more positive or healthy. But I think just the way that some of the examples were put together in the chapters, like I found myself kind of skimming through some of this too. Like I wasn't finding it super compelling in the way that some of the other nonfiction books I read have been very compelling. So if you like this topic, I would definitely recommend it, but I don't know that I would pick this up otherwise, other than wanting to learn a lot more about this topic. Okay, next up I read TJ Klune's Under the Whispering Door, another alphabet challenge book for the month. I had heard amazing things about this book. I don't necessarily agree with the reviews that I read, and I actually went on Goodreads and was like, what are people saying about this book now that I've read it? And I found a review that I actually like really 100% agreed with. And basically what that person said was, the beginning of the book is great. Like it has a really nice premise. Basically there's a man who has died, and in this world you have like consciousness after you die, and he gets like taken on a journey that helps him kind of come to a better realization of himself and his life. There's a whole section in the middle that I think could have been stronger. I think probably could have been edited down. It felt very long. And then the part at the end was also pretty strong. So it's like it bookends with a couple, really strong beginning and ending portions, but there's this whole section in the middle that feels kind of muddled, and it feels like it could have had a stronger editor. Now, there's another book by this author that was the first book by this author that I became aware of that I will read because I've just heard really good things about it as well. So I wouldn't say I'm never going to revisit this author. I actually think it was a really interesting take on what's going on with this character. I also don't think it's giving too much away to say this is a kind of queer love story. And I loved that element of the book because I don't think we often see that in literary fiction. And so I appreciated, that element of it. But there's a whole section in the middle that I just thought was edited oddly, and could have been trimmed down quite a bit. So I also maybe would have appreciated listening to this more on audio than reading it. I'm not sure, but take that for what it's worth. Okay, then I read a book that I just kind of randomly threw on my TBR pile, and it's called Remote Office Not Required. This is by David Hansen, who is one of the founders of Basecamp, which is a company that makes a project management software. And I read this because, I manage a hybrid team at work. I have some people who are fully remote. I have some people who are partially remote, and wanted to just kind of get some ideas. I would say this is a quick read. It's also a dated read at this point in what we're dealing with post or in the middle of COVID with remote working. This was really making an argument for remote work in I would say early 2010, into maybe 2015. So pre-pandemic, and really trying to, in a very basic way, explain to people why they shouldn't be concerned about workers who want to be remote, who want to be hybrid, and that there's a lot of benefits to it. I think a lot of what we've learned through the pandemic is a lot of what's covered in this book. So not necessarily a whole lot new that's coming out of this. And then the last book that I read in the month was Rebecca Searle's One Italian Summer. This is one that I've just seen coming up a lot in my Instagram and social media feed around Bookstagram, and probably because it's a good summer read with summer in the title. I will be honest, I picked it up because I was getting to the end of the month and I didn't have a whole lot of time, and it was a very fast read because I had it on audio. This is a relatively short book, under 300 pages. The general premise of this book is you have a woman who is grieving the loss of her mother, and she travels to Italy. She's in kind of a troubled marriage, trying to figure out what to do. And when she gets to Italy, she encounters her mother as in her younger years, as I think a 30-year-old. And so she's basically encountering her mother younger when she herself is an adult. So kind of a bit of a twist in terms of just how the story is set up. I thought the story was fine. I mean, I don't know that I would highly recommend this book. I mean, I found it generally interesting. I think if you like stories about mothers and daughters, this would be a really interesting book to pick up. But nothing really stood out to me about it. I think that it would make a pretty good summer read, or a beach read if you're interested in something like that. I don't know that I would revisit anything by this author. I'd have to kind of look at the plot of other books to see if I was interested. So I guess in the end, I can't highly recommend it, but I would say if there's specific things about that kind of book that you like, I would definitely pick it up. Okay, so those are the 22 books that I read in June, and looking forward to sharing what is going to be on my TBR list for July. Take a look at that upcoming video soon, and until then, happy reading.